Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we journey into the forgotten heart of Pennsylvania, where small towns cradle secrets darker than their coal mines, and where 10 real people discovered that the greatest horrors do not announce themselves with fanfare, but instead whisper through empty streets, hide behind friendly faces, and wait in basements no one dares to enter. These are not legends passed down through generations. These are documented accounts of ordinary individuals who stumbled into nightmare scenarios they never saw coming, events that law enforcement still discusses in hushed tones, and mysteries that continue to haunt the communities where they occurred. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. James had always dreamed of leaving the noise and chaos of Philadelphia behind, and when he found the small rental house in Minersville, Schuylkill County, it felt like fate had finally smiled on him. The town sat nestled between forested hills, its population barely cresting 3,000 souls, and the rent was half what he had been paying for his cramped apartment in the city. The landlord, a man named Carl Dietrich with weathered hands and a thick Pennsylvania Dutch accent, handed him the keys on a crisp October morning and told him the neighbors were good people who looked out for each other. James believed him. After 32 years of urban anonymity, the promise of community felt like a gift. The house itself was modest but charming, a 2-bedroom Cape Cod with white aluminum siding and black shutters that needed paint. It sat on Elm Street, a quiet residential block where children rode bicycles and elderly couples walked their dogs in the evenings. James spent his first week unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and familiarizing himself with the rhythms of small-town life. He worked remotely as a software developer, which meant his days were spent in front of a computer screen while the town moved around him like a slow river. He found comfort in the routine, in the way the mail carrier waved every afternoon at 2:15, in the distant sound of the high school marching band practicing on Wednesday evenings. His neighbor to the east, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, introduced herself on his third day in town. She was 74 years old, she told him proudly. With silver hair, she wore in a neat bun and a collection of floral house dresses that seemed to come from a different era. She arrived at his front door carrying a homemade apple pie that was still warm, the crust perfectly golden and crimped along the edges. James invited her in for coffee, grateful for the kindness, and they sat at his small kitchen table while she asked about his life, his work, and what had brought him to Minersville. He found himself opening up more than he usually did with strangers, telling her about the divorce that had left him financially drained, about his desire for peace and simplicity. Mrs. Kowalski listened with what seemed like genuine compassion, patting his hand occasionally and assuring him that he had made the right choice. When she left an hour later, James felt certain he had found exactly what he had been searching for. The relationship that developed over the following weeks felt natural and unforced. Mrs. Kowalski would bring him dinner 2 or 3 times a week, explaining that she cooked too much for one person and hated to see food go to waste. James would help her carry groceries or take out her trash, small favors that seemed like fair exchange for her generosity. She told him stories about Minersville, about the coal mining history that had built the town and the families that had lived there for generations. She spoke of her late husband, Walter, who had worked in the mines for 40 years before black lung took him in 1998. James listened and nodded, genuinely interested in the oral history she offered so freely. It was mid-November when James first noticed the unusual traffic at Mrs. Kowalski's house. He worked in the converted second bedroom that faced her property, and his desk sat positioned beside the window where afternoon light provided the best illumination. He began to observe a pattern of visitors arriving at odd hours, usually after dark. always parking in her detached garage rather than on the street. The visitors never stayed long, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes at most, and they always left carrying large canvas bags or boxes. James told himself it was none of his business, that Mrs. Kowalski probably ran some kind of home business, or perhaps hosted a card game for other seniors in town. But the rationalizations became harder to maintain as November turned to December, and the traffic increased. James started documenting the license plates in a spreadsheet, not because he suspected anything criminal, he told himself, but because he had always been someone who noticed patterns and felt compelled to understand them. The vehicles came from all over eastern Pennsylvania, Reading, Allentown, Harrisburg, even a few from across the border in New Jersey. None of the visitors looked like elderly card players. They were younger, mostly men, with the hardened expressions of people who had lived difficult lives. The first real warning sign came on a Tuesday evening in mid-December. James had been returning from the grocery store when he saw Mrs. Kowalski standing in her driveway, talking to a man who towered over her diminutive frame. Even from 30 feet away, James could see the tension in their body language, could hear the sharp edge in their lowered voices. As he climbed out of his car with his bags, the man turned toward him, and James found himself looking into eyes that held no warmth whatsoever. Mrs. Kowalski quickly placed herself between them, her usual cheerful demeanor slipping back into place like a mask. She called out a greeting to James, then gently guided the man toward her garage. The man looked back once more before disappearing inside, and James felt a cold sensation settle in his stomach. That night, James could not sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind rattle his windows and thinking about the expression on that man's face, about the bags and boxes, about the increasing frequency of visitors. At 3 a.m, he finally admitted to himself what he had been avoiding for weeks. Something illegal was happening next door. The question was what, and more importantly, what he should do about it. Mrs. Kowalski had been nothing but kind to him. She had welcomed him when he was lonely and displaced. The idea of betraying that kindness felt wrong, but the idea of turning a blind eye to criminal activity felt equally troubling. He decided to gather more information before making any decisions. Over the next week, James began taking walks at various times of day and night, always carrying his phone with its camera ready. He photographed license plates, recorded times of arrivals and departures, and tried to identify patterns in the operation. What he discovered was a level of organization that surprised him. The visitors came in shifts, never overlapping, always punctual. Mrs. Kowalski ran her operation with the precision of someone who had been doing it for years. On December 22nd, James finally saw something concrete. A visitor had parked carelessly, leaving his car partially blocking the sidewalk, and when he emerged from Mrs. Kowalski's garage carrying his usual canvas bag, the fabric had shifted to reveal its contents. James, standing 50 feet away pretending to check his mailbox, saw clear plastic packages filled with white powder. His hand shook as he walked back to his house. Mrs. Kowalski was not running a card game. She was dealing drugs, and from the volume of traffic, she had been doing it for a very long time. James spent Christmas Eve wrestling with his conscience. He sat alone in his house, the apple pie long since eaten, and tried to reconcile the kind woman who had befriended him with the criminal enterprise operating 30 feet from his bedroom. He thought about calling the police anonymously, about packing up and leaving, about confronting Mrs. Kowalski directly. Each option carried risks he did not want to face. The decision was made for him on December 26th. James received a knock on his door at 9 in the evening. When he opened it, he found Mrs. Kowalski standing on his porch, but the warm grandmother figure had vanished. In her place stood someone cold and calculating, someone whose eyes held the same emptiness he had seen in her visitor weeks earlier. She did not wait for an invitation. She pushed past him into his living room and closed the door behind her. She told him she had noticed his increased interest in her activities. She told him she had friends who made problems disappear. She told him that Minersville was her town and had been for 40 years, and that outsiders who did not mind their own business tended not to stay long. The words were delivered in the same gentle voice she had used when offering him pie, which somehow made them more terrifying. James stood frozen as she continued, explaining that she knew about his divorce, his debts, his lack of family nearby. She knew everything about him because she made it her business to know everything about everyone in her territory. Then her tone shifted. She told him she liked him, that he seemed like a smart young man who understood how the world really worked. She made him an offer. He could work for her, keeping track of inventory and schedules with the same precision he had demonstrated while spying on her. The pay would be generous, far more than his software job provided, or he could pack his things and leave Minersville within 48 hours and never speak of what he had seen. Those were his only two options. There was no third choice that ended well for him. James told her he needed time to think. Mrs. Kowalski smiled and patted his cheek the way she had done when they first met. She told him he had until noon the next day to decide. Then she left, closing the door gently behind her. James spent the night packing. By dawn, he had loaded everything essential into his car. But before he left, he did something that terrified him more than anything else in his life. He drove to the state police barracks in Pottsville, 15 miles away, and told them everything. He showed them his photographs, his spreadsheets, his documentation of months of activity. He told them about Mrs. Kowalski's threats and her offer. The troopers listened, with expressions that suggested nothing surprised them anymore. They told him to leave Pennsylvania immediately, to stay with friends or family far away while they built their case. They told him Mrs. Kowalski had been suspected for years, but had always been too careful, too protected by community loyalty and strategic payoffs. His evidence, combined with their existing investigation, might finally be enough. James drove west that morning, his car packed with everything he owned for the second time in 6 months. He did not stop until he reached his brother's house in Ohio, 400 miles from Minersville. He stayed there for 3 weeks, jumping at every unexpected sound, checking news websites obsessively for updates. The raid happened on January 15th. State and federal agents descended on Elm Street at dawn, executing search warrants on Mrs. Kowalski's house and garage. They found over 30 kilograms of cocaine, along with methamphetamine, heroin, and detailed records of a distribution network that stretched across 4 states. Mrs. Kowalski was arrested along with 6 associates. The local news reported that she had been operating since the early 1980s, taking over the business after her husband died and expanding it far beyond what he had built. James never went back to Minersville. His landlord allowed him to break the lease under the circumstances, and friends packed up his remaining belongings and shipped them to Ohio. He eventually moved to Pittsburgh, where he found a new apartment and tried to rebuild his life once again. But the experience changed him in ways he was still discovering. He no longer trusted kindness at face value. He no longer believed in the innocence of small towns. And sometimes, late at night, he still thought about apple pie and wondered whether any gesture of welcome could ever again feel genuine rather than calculated. The price of doing the right thing, he learned, was the permanent loss of the person he had been before Mrs. Kowalski knocked on his door that December evening. Some kinds of innocence, once shattered, could never be recovered. Ella Whitmore disappeared on October 14, 1987 from her family's farm outside Bird in Hand, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. She was 17 years old, a junior at Pacoya Valley High School, and by all accounts a responsible young woman who helped her parents manage their 200 acres of corn and dairy cattle. The last confirmed sighting of Ella was at approximately 7:30 that Wednesday evening, when her younger brother Samuel saw her walking toward the southern cornfield carrying a flashlight. She never returned to the house, and by the time her parents realized she was missing 3 hours later, the autumn darkness had swallowed every trace of where she had gone. The Whitmore family had lived on that land for 4 generations. Ella's great-grandfather had purchased the property in 1923, and each successive generation had expanded the operation until it became one of the more productive farms in the region. The family was well respected in their community. Regular attendees at Calvary Presbyterian Church, known for their honesty in business dealings and their willingness to help neighbors during difficult harvests. Ella herself was described by friends and teachers as quiet but friendly, studious without being withdrawn, the kind of young woman who volunteered at the local library and sang in the church choir every Sunday morning. The evening of her disappearance had been unremarkable in almost every way. The family had finished dinner at 6:45, the same time they ate every weeknight. Ella's mother, Margaret, had prepared pot roast with potatoes and carrots, and the family had sat together at the kitchen table discussing ordinary matters: Samuel's upcoming science fair project, repairs needed on the barn roof, the forecast predicting frost by the end of the week. After dinner, Ella had washed the dishes while her mother dried and put them away, a routine they had performed thousands of times. Her father, Robert, had gone out to the barn to check on a pregnant cow that was close to delivering. Samuel had retreated to his room to work on homework. At approximately 7:20, Ella had told her mother she was going to walk down to the southern cornfield to check whether the irrigation equipment had been turned off properly. Her father had been working in that field earlier in the day and had mentioned at dinner that he thought he might have left one of the valves open. Ella offered to check so her father would not have to make the walk after his long day. Margaret had thought nothing of the request. The southern field was only a quarter mile from the house, easily visible from the kitchen window during daylight hours, and Ella had walked those fields alone hundreds of times throughout her childhood. Samuel, whose bedroom window faced south toward the cornfields, had been the last person to see his sister. He told investigators that he had looked up from his textbook at approximately 7:30 and had seen Ella's flashlight beam moving along the dirt path that led to the southern field. He had watched for perhaps 30 seconds before returning his attention to his homework, thinking nothing unusual about the scene. The flashlight had been moving at a normal pace, not hurried or erratic. Everything had appeared routine. When Ella had not returned by 9 o'clock, Margaret began to worry. Robert had come in from the barn at 8:30 and had assumed Ella was in her room studying. When Margaret went upstairs to check and found Ella's room empty, the bed still neatly made from that morning, they both went to Samuel's room to ask if he knew where his sister had gone. Samuel told them about seeing her walk toward the southern field, and Robert immediately grabbed his own flashlight and headed out to find her. He found the irrigation valve properly closed. He found no sign of his daughter. He walked the entire perimeter of the cornfield, calling Ella's name into the darkness, hearing nothing but the wind moving through the dried stalks. He checked the equipment shed, the small storage building where they kept tools and fertilizer, even the ancient well house that had not been used since the 1950s. Nothing. By 10 o'clock, Robert had called the Pennsylvania State Police. By 10:30, troopers had arrived and begun a preliminary search. By midnight, over 50 volunteers from the community had gathered with flashlights and began walking systematic grid patterns through the Whitmore property. They searched through the night and into the following day, expanding their perimeter to include neighboring farms, the wooded areas that bordered the property to the east, and the small creek that ran through the valley half a mile away. On the second day of searching, a trooper found Ella's shoes at the edge of the southern cornfield, positioned neatly side by side on the dirt path approximately 30 feet from where it entered the standing corn. They were her everyday sneakers, white canvas keds with blue laces, and they showed no signs of struggle or disturbance. They had simply been removed and placed carefully on the ground, as if Ella had stopped walking, taken them off, and continued barefoot into the field. The discovery of the shoes changed the nature of the investigation. Search dogs were brought in and given Ella's scent from clothing in her room. The dogs tracked to where the shoes had been found, then lost the trail entirely. It was as if Ella had vanished into the air at that exact spot. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment flew over the area. The cornfield was harvested early, so investigators could search every inch of ground. Ponds on neighboring properties were dragged. The creek was walked and rewalked by teams of volunteers. Nothing else belonging to Ella was ever found. The investigation consumed Lancaster County for months. Theories proliferated wildly. Some believed Ella had run away, perhaps pregnant, or involved in a relationship her parents had not known about. But friends at school insisted Ella had not been dating anyone, and a search of her room revealed no hidden diary, no secret correspondence, no plane or bus tickets. Her savings account at the local bank contained $412 that was never touched. Others suggested she had suffered some kind of mental break and wandered off in confusion. But Ella had no history of psychological problems, no recent trauma, no behavior that suggested instability. More sinister theories emerged as the investigation dragged on with no answers. Some speculated that a stranger had been hiding in the cornfield and had abducted Ella when she walked past. But the shoes suggested otherwise. Victims of sudden abduction do not stop to remove their footwear and place it neatly on the ground. Others whispered about Ella's father, about possible abuse that might have driven her to flee or worse. Investigators examined Robert Whitmore's life thoroughly and found nothing suspicious. He had no criminal record, no reports of domestic violence, no financial problems that might suggest desperation. Friends and family insisted he was a devoted father who had been devastated by his daughter's disappearance. As 1987 turned to 1988, the active search was scaled back. The case remained open, the file growing thick with witness statements and search reports and theories that led nowhere. The Whitmore family continued to hope, kept Ella's room exactly as she had left it, appeared on local news programs pleading for information. Margaret's hair turned white within a year. Robert stopped attending church, unable to reconcile his faith with the loss of his daughter. Samuel, who had been 14 when his sister disappeared, grew up haunted by the memory of that flashlight beam moving away from the house. The years passed without resolution. In 1992, a hiker found human remains in the woods 15 miles from the Whitmore farm, and for one terrible week, the family believed they might finally have answers. DNA testing proved the remains belonged to someone else entirely. In 1999, a woman in Ohio claimed to be Ella, but she was exposed as a fraud within days. In 2003, a deathbed confession by a convicted serial killer included claims about a victim matching Ella's description, but investigators determined the confession was false, another attempt at posthumous notoriety. The truth, if it existed, remained as elusive as Ella herself had become that October evening. Some in the community believed the answer lay in the old stories about the land itself, about the Lenape who had lived there before European settlement, about the hollow in the woods where strange lights had been reported for over a century. These stories were dismissed by investigators as superstition, but they persisted in whispered conversations among those who had lived in Lancaster County for generations. In 2012, on the 25th anniversary of Ella's disappearance, a journalist from Philadelphia wrote a long feature article about the case. The article included interviews with Ella's former classmates, now in their 40s, who spoke about the shadow the disappearance had cast over their entire high school experience. It included an interview with Samuel Whitmore, then 39 years old and working as an engineer in Pittsburgh, who said he still sometimes dreamed about that flashlight beam and wondered what would have happened if he had called out to his sister or gone with her to the field. Margaret Whitmore had died in 2008. Her last words, reportedly, a request that someone please find her daughter and bring her home. Robert lived until 2015, spending his final years sitting on the farmhouse porch and staring at the southern field where his daughter had last been seen. He never sold the property, never moved away, never stopped waiting for an answer that never came. The farm was sold at auction in 2016. The new owners tore down the old farmhouse and built a modern home on the same foundation. They planted soybeans instead of corn. They knew nothing about Ella Whitmore except what they read in the disclosure documents, a paragraph about an unsolved disappearance nearly 30 years earlier. But the shoes remained part of the evidence file at the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks, sealed in a plastic bag with a case number written in faded ink. And the question remained unanswered. Why had Ella removed her shoes that night? Where had she gone after stepping out of them? And was the answer something that could be explained by logic and evidence, or was it something else entirely? Something that existed in the space between what we know and what we can never understand. The Ella Whitmore case remains open. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Pennsylvania State Police. Ryan Chen had spent 6 months searching for the perfect place to escape the suffocating pressure of his life in Manhattan. At 34, he had burned out completely from his career in financial consulting, and the panic attacks that had started during his last year at the firm had convinced him that a drastic change was necessary. When he found the listing for a 3-bedroom house in Tobyhanna, Pennsylvania, deep in the Pocono Mountains, he thought he had discovered exactly what he needed. The price was impossibly low, $47,000 for a property that should have been worth at least 3 times that amount. The listing agent, a woman named Patricia Moss, who spoke with a thick local accent, explained that the house had been in foreclosure, and the bank was eager to move it quickly. Ryan, who had enough savings to buy the property outright, made an offer the same day he saw the photographs. The house sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through dense hemlock and pine forest. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the small town center of Tobyhanna was a 15-minute drive down the mountain. The property itself was larger than Ryan had expected, sitting on nearly 3 acres of wooded land, with a small creek running along the eastern boundary. The house had been built in 1974, a split-level design with dark wood paneling and orange shag carpet that screamed of its era. But the bones were solid, the roof was relatively new, and Ryan convinced himself that he could update it gradually while working remotely on the freelance projects he had lined up. He moved in during the first week of November, driving his rented moving truck up the steep driveway with a sense of accomplishment he had not felt in years. The isolation was exactly what he wanted. No sirens, no crowds, no expectations beyond what he set for himself. That first night he slept more soundly than he had in months, lulled by the absolute silence of the mountain. The first incident happened on his 4th night in the house. Ryan had been working late in the spare bedroom he had converted into an office, finishing a financial analysis for a client in Chicago. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, he heard footsteps directly above him on the main floor. Distinct, heavy footsteps that moved from the kitchen area toward the living room. Ryan froze at his desk, listening as the footsteps continued for perhaps 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. His first instinct was that someone had broken in, and he grabbed his phone and quietly climbed the stairs from the lower level where his office was located. The main floor was empty. Every door and window remained locked exactly as he had left them. Ryan searched every room, checked every closet, even went outside with a flashlight to examine the exterior for signs of forced entry. Nothing. He convinced himself that he had heard the house settling, old timbers adjusting to temperature, changes, the kind of sounds that every old house made but seemed amplified in the silence of the mountains. But the footsteps returned the next night at approximately the same time, and the night after that. Always between 2 and 2:30 in the morning, always following the same path from kitchen to living room. Ryan began staying awake to listen for them, and he started to notice other details that troubled him. The footsteps seemed to have a rhythm, a deliberate quality that did not match random settling noises, and they always stopped in exactly the same spot, right in front of the stone fireplace that dominated the living room's east wall. On the 8th night, Ryan set up his laptop to record audio while he slept. The next morning, he listened back to the file and heard the footsteps clearly captured, along with something else that made his skin crawl. After the footsteps stopped, there was a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor, followed by what might have been a voice. The audio quality was too poor to make out words, but the cadence was unmistakably human speech. Ryan spent that morning researching the house's history. The county records showed that the property had changed hands 4 times since 1974. The original owners, a couple named Douglas and Patricia Hendricks, had lived there for 12 years before selling in 1986. The next owners, the Kowalski family, had stayed only 18 months before moving. The third owners, whose names were listed as Vincent and Sarah Torres, had owned the property for 6 years, but according to the deed records, had not lived there for the final 3 years, instead renting it out before finally selling in 2004. The most recent owners before foreclosure were listed as David Brennan, a single man who had purchased the house in 2004 and had defaulted on his mortgage in 2023. Ryan tried to find contact information for any of the previous owners, but had no success with internet searches. The Hendricks would be in their 70s or 80s if they were still alive. The others had apparently left no digital footprint he could follow. He considered contacting Patricia Moss to ask about the house's history, but worried that bringing up strange occurrences would make him look foolish or mentally unstable. The phenomena escalated. On November 19th, Ryan came home from a supply run to find every cabinet door in the kitchen standing open. He was certain he had closed them before leaving. On November 21st, he woke to find that someone had rearranged the books on his living room shelf, organizing them by color rather than the author order he had established. On November 24th, he discovered that the furniture in his bedroom had been moved several inches from where it had been, creating a clear path from the door to the window. Ryan stopped sleeping properly. He would lie awake, listening for sounds, documenting everything in a notebook, trying to find rational explanations. He checked for carbon monoxide and found nothing. He examined the possibility of animals in the walls or attic and found no evidence. He even considered that he might be experiencing a psychological break, that the stress of his old life had damaged something fundamental in his mind. But the audio recordings did not lie. The footsteps were real, captured by technology that had no reason to hallucinate. On December 1st, Ryan decided to examine the area where the footsteps always stopped. The fireplace was massive, built from river stone and rising 16 feet to the cathedral ceiling. The hearth extended 4 feet into the room, creating a broad platform of slate tile. Ryan got down on his hands and knees and examined every inch of it, running his fingers along the grout lines, pressing on stones to see if any were loose. In the far right corner, where the hearth met the wall, he found something that did not belong. It was a small symbol carved into the grout between 2 slate tiles, barely visible unless you were looking for it. The symbol resembled a circle with 3 lines radiating from the center, primitive and deliberate. Ryan took photographs and searched online for similar symbols, eventually finding matches in websites about folk magic and protective sigils. The symbol, according to multiple sources, was meant to trap malevolent spirits within a bounded area. Ryan felt his rational mind trying to reject the implication. He did not believe in ghosts or spirits or supernatural explanations, but he also could not explain what was happening in his house through any conventional means. That night, he called his sister Monica, who lived in Boston. She listened to his account with patience, but eventually suggested that he was experiencing stress-related paranoia and should see a doctor. Ryan hung up feeling more alone than ever. On December 4th, the entity, or whatever it was, manifested visually. Ryan had been in the kitchen at 9:30 in the evening when the temperature dropped suddenly, his breath becoming visible in the air. He turned to find a shadow standing in front of the fireplace, roughly human-shaped but lacking any defined features. It stood motionless for perhaps 10 seconds before dissipating like smoke. Ryan stood paralyzed, his heart hammering against his ribs, unable to process what he had just witnessed. He packed a bag that night and checked into a motel in Stroudsburg, 15 miles from the house. But lying in the generic comfort of the motel room, he felt anger replace his fear. He had paid $47,000 for that house. He had invested weeks of work making it livable. He was not going to be driven away by something he did not understand. He went back the next morning, determined to find answers. Ryan began researching David Brennan, the previous owner who had let the house go into foreclosure. After hours of searching, he found an obituary. David Brennan had died in March 2023, at age 49, in a single-vehicle accident on Route 423 near Tobyhanna. The obituary was sparse, listing no surviving family and no details about his life. Ryan wondered if Brennan's death and the foreclosure were connected to whatever was wrong with the house. He continued digging and eventually found a newspaper article from February 2023, 2 months before Brennan's death. The article described a disturbance call at an address Ryan recognized as his own house. Police had responded to reports of someone shouting and breaking furniture. When they arrived, they found Brennan alone, highly agitated, claiming that someone was trying to hurt him. He was evaluated at a local hospital and released. The article ended there, offering no follow-up. Ryan sat in his office staring at the article, feeling connections form that he did not want to acknowledge. How many previous owners had experienced what he was experiencing now? How many had left without explanation, or worse, stayed too long? He made a decision. He would sell the house immediately, take whatever loss was necessary, and leave before whatever had happened to David Brennan happened to him. He contacted Patricia Moss, who seemed unsurprised by his decision to resell so quickly. She listed the property without asking questions. Ryan moved out on December 10th, renting an apartment in Stroudsburg while waiting for the house to sell. But the phenomena did not stop. Objects in his apartment began moving on their own. He heard footsteps in the middle of the night. The shadow appeared twice, standing silently in corners before vanishing. He realized with growing horror that whatever was in that house had followed him. Or perhaps it had been waiting for him specifically, though he could not imagine why. The house sold in January to a young couple from New Jersey, who saw the same opportunity Ryan had seen. He thought about warning them, but could not find the words that would not sound insane. Ryan left Pennsylvania entirely in February, moving to Vermont, where he rented a small cottage and tried to rebuild his life. The phenomena gradually decreased in frequency, though they never stopped completely. Sometimes late at night he still hears footsteps. Sometimes he still sees shadows that should not exist. And he wonders whether what he experienced was something trapped in that house, or something that had been waiting there all along for the right person to set it free. The house in Tobyhanna stands occupied. The new owners have made no complaints. Perhaps they hear nothing, or perhaps they simply have not been there long enough yet. Ryan will never know, and he has no intention of returning to find out. Haley Morrison had never been particularly interested in genealogy until her mother died in the spring of 2019. Going through Margaret Morrison's belongings in the small house in McKeesport, just outside Pittsburgh, Haley discovered boxes of family documents that her mother had collected over decades but never organized. There were birth certificates, marriage licenses, immigration papers, photographs of stern-faced ancestors standing in front of houses that no longer existed. Haley, who was 38 and recently divorced with too much time on her hands, decided to honor her mother's memory by finally assembling a proper family tree. She started with what she knew. Her mother, Margaret, had been born in 1947 to Dorothy and Frank Sullivan in nearby Duquesne, a steel town that had thrived and then declined, along with the industry that built it. Margaret had married Thomas Morrison in 1969, and they had raised Haley and her younger brother Colin in the same McKeesport house, where Haley now sorted through decades of accumulated possessions. The deeper history became murkier. Dorothy Sullivan had rarely spoken about her own childhood, and by the time Haley was old enough to ask questions, her grandmother had developed dementia that erased most memories before they could be shared. Haley spent weeks scanning documents and uploading them to an ancestry website, connecting names and dates into branches that stretched back through Pennsylvania history. The Sullivan line traced back to Irish immigrants who had arrived in the 1890s and settled in the coal regions north of Pittsburgh. The further back she went, the more obsessed she became, staying up late into the night following digital breadcrumbs through census records and newspaper archives. It was during one of these late-night research sessions in July that Haley found the first mention of Walter Kensington. The name appeared in a 1972 newspaper article from the Daily News in McKeesport, a brief item about a missing person case. Walter Kensington, age 43, had been reported missing by his employer at Duquesne Steelworks on March 18, 1972. He had failed to show up for his shift and had not been seen since. The article mentioned that he lived alone in a boarding house on Grant Avenue and that police were investigating but had no leads. Haley might have dismissed the article as irrelevant to her family research except for one detail. The boarding house address was 447 Grant Avenue, and according to the property records she had already examined, that address had been owned in 1972 by Dorothy and Frank Sullivan, her grandparents. They had owned the building from 1968 until 1975, when they sold it and moved to a smaller home. Haley searched for follow-up articles about Walter Kensington but found nothing. She checked the missing person databases and discovered his case was still open, still unsolved after 47 years. She searched obituary records and found no death certificate. Walter Kensington had simply disappeared from existence in March 1972, and as far as the official record was concerned, he had never been found. The discovery unsettled Haley in ways she could not immediately articulate. Her grandmother Dorothy had died in 2003, taking whatever she might have known about a missing tenant with her. Her grandfather Frank had died even earlier in 1989, but the coincidence felt too significant to ignore. Haley began digging deeper, looking for any connection between Walter Kensington and her grandparents beyond the simple landlord-tenant relationship. She found property tax records showing that Dorothy and Frank had taken out a loan in April 1972, just 1 month after Kensington disappeared, to renovate the boarding house basement. She found a brief mention in a local history book about Grant Avenue, which noted that 447 had been converted from a boarding house to apartments in 1973. She found a photograph in her mother's belongings, unlabeled and undated, showing her grandfather Frank standing in what appeared to be a basement with concrete dust covering his clothes and a grim expression on his face. Haley's brother Colin, when she called him in Denver, where he had moved for work, told her she was inventing connections where none existed. Plenty of tenants had probably lived in that boarding house over the years. The fact that one had gone missing was tragic, but not sinister. The loan for basement renovation was probably unrelated. Haley wanted to believe him, but something about the timeline bothered her. Every piece of information she uncovered seemed to point toward March 1972 as a pivotal moment in her grandparents' lives. She decided to visit the building at 447 Grant Avenue. It still stood, though the neighborhood had deteriorated significantly since her grandparents' era. The structure was a 3-story brick building that had been divided into 6 apartments, now managed by a property company based in Pittsburgh. Haley explained to the current manager that her grandparents had once owned the building and that she was researching family history. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Sandra Ochoa, gave her permission to look around the common areas, but said the apartments themselves were occupied and she could not allow access without tenant permission. Haley examined the basement, which had been converted into a laundry facility and storage area. The concrete floor looked relatively new, or at least newer than the 1920s construction date of the building. The walls were exposed brick, painted white, with newer electrical wiring running along the surface rather than through the walls. Haley found herself examining every inch of that floor, looking for irregularities, for seams that might suggest something had been buried and then covered. She felt ridiculous doing it. She was a 48-year-old accountant crawling around a basement with a flashlight, acting out a crime drama that existed only in her imagination. But she could not shake the feeling that Walter Kensington had not simply walked away from his life in March 1972. He had disappeared from a building her grandparents owned, and 1 month later, they had renovated the basement. Haley spent the next 2 months tracking down anyone who might have known her grandparents during that period. She found 3 former neighbors still living in McKeesport, all in their 80s now, all with memories that had grown fuzzy with time. One woman, Edith Kowalski, remembered Dorothy Sullivan as a nervous woman who had become more withdrawn after 1972. Another neighbor, Joseph Marks, remembered that Frank Sullivan had done the basement renovation himself rather than hiring contractors, which had seemed odd for such an extensive project. The third neighbor, Catherine Wu, did not remember the Sullivans at all but recalled hearing rumors in the 1970s about problems at the boarding house on Grant Avenue. In September, Haley hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb, who specialized in cold cases. She gave him everything she had found and asked him to determine whether her suspicions had any foundation in reality. Webb, a former Pittsburgh police detective, took 2 weeks to compile his report. When he called Haley to discuss his findings, his tone was careful and professional, but she heard the underlying concern. Webb had discovered that Walter Kensington had no living relatives and no close friends. He had been a solitary man who worked at the steel mill and spent his evenings alone in his boarding house room. But Webb had found something else. He had located the original police report from 1972, which had been filed by Kensington's supervisor at the mill. According to the report, Kensington had told a co-worker on March 17, 1972, that he was planning to confront his landlord about unpaid repairs and potentially illegal building code violations. He had specifically mentioned the basement, which he claimed was being used for purposes that violated zoning laws. Webb had also discovered that Frank Sullivan had been interviewed by police during the missing person investigation, but the interview notes were minimal. Frank had stated that Kensington had paid his rent through the end of March, had packed up his belongings, and had left without notice. Frank claimed to have no knowledge of where Kensington might have gone. The police had apparently accepted this explanation and closed the investigation after determining that Kensington was an adult who had the right to disappear if he chose to do so. But Webb had found one more detail that made Haley's hands tremble as she held the phone. In June 1972, 3 months after Kensington's disappearance, a worker at the steel mill named Raymond Torres had filed a police report claiming that Frank Sullivan had threatened him. According to Torres, Sullivan had approached him in a bar and told him to stop asking questions about Walter Kensington, or Torres would regret it. Torres had been one of Kensington's few acquaintances at the mill. The police report noted that Sullivan denied making any threats, and Torres eventually dropped the matter. Haley sat in her living room after the conversation with Webb, staring at the photograph of her grandfather Frank that sat on her mantel. She had loved him as a child, remembered him as patient and kind, remembered Sunday dinners and birthday presents and his gentle laughter. She could not reconcile that memory with the possibility that he had killed a man and buried the body in his own basement. She called the McKeesport Police Department and asked to speak with someone about a cold case. She was transferred 3 times before reaching Detective Sarah Chen, who listened to Haley's account with professional interest. Chen explained that reopening a case from 1972 would require significant evidence, not just suspicions and circumstantial connections. But Chen agreed to review the original case file and the information Haley had compiled. 2 weeks later, Chen called back. The department had decided to pursue the case further. They had obtained a warrant to use ground-penetrating radar in the basement of 447 Grant Avenue. The scan had revealed an anomaly beneath the concrete floor, an area approximately 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, where the soil density differed from the surrounding area. They were seeking permission from the current building owner to excavate. Haley received the call on a Tuesday in November. Investigators had broken through the concrete in the southeastern corner of the basement and had found human remains wrapped in plastic sheeting and buried approximately 4 feet below the surface. Dental records would take time to confirm, but the remains appeared to be those of an adult male, and the decomposition was consistent with burial in the early 1970s. The confirmation came 3 weeks later. The remains were Walter Kensington. He had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, then buried in the basement of the building where he had lived. The investigation had been reopened as a homicide. Though with both Frank and Dorothy Sullivan long dead, there would never be criminal charges or trial. Haley learned additional details over the following months as the investigation continued. Detectives theorized that Frank Sullivan had confronted Kensington about his threats to report code violations, and that the confrontation had turned violent. Dorothy had likely helped cover up the crime, which explained the personality change her former neighbors had remembered. The basement renovation had been an attempt to permanently conceal the evidence. Haley arranged for Walter Kensington to be buried properly in a cemetery plot she purchased in McKeesport. She attended the small funeral service along with Detective Chen and Marcus Webb. There were no other mourners. Kensington had no family. To speak for him, no one to remember his life beyond the tragic way it had ended. The story made regional news briefly. Haley declined interview requests, unable to articulate the complex emotion she felt. She had solved a 47-year-old mystery and given a missing man a proper burial, but she had also destroyed her image of her grandparents and her understanding of her own family history. She thought about her mother, Margaret, who must have known or at least suspected something about what her parents had done. She thought about all the family dinners where this terrible secret had sat at the table alongside the ordinary conversations about weather and work and everyday concerns. Haley stopped working on the family tree. She boxed up the genealogy documents and stored them in her garage, unable to continue tracing a history that now felt contaminated by violence and lies. Some branches of a family tree, she realized, were better left unexplored. Some questions were better left unanswered, and some truths once discovered changed everything about who you thought you were and where you thought you came from. Adam Torres had been a police officer for 11 years in Reading, Pennsylvania, before taking the position of sheriff in Wyalusing, a small town along the Susquehanna River in Bradford County. At 36, he was young for the role, but the town council had been desperate to fill the vacancy after Sheriff Harold Brennan died suddenly of a heart attack while fishing at the old quarry. Adam had grown up in a city environment where crime followed predictable patterns, and departmental support was always a radio call away. Wyalusing, with its population of barely 600 and its single-cell holding area that passed for a jail, seemed like an opportunity for a quieter life after years of stress that had contributed to his divorce. He arrived in August of 2018, moving his belongings into the small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street. The town welcomed him with cautious politeness, the kind of reception given to all outsiders in communities where families had known each other for generations. The mayor, a man named Richard Davison, who also ran the only gas station in town, gave Adam a tour of the town's facilities and explained that his main duties would involve responding to domestic disputes, checking on elderly residents during harsh weather, and occasionally dealing with teenagers who thought abandoned buildings made good places to drink beer. But Davison had also mentioned the quarry. He had done it almost casually while they drove past the access road that led east toward the Susquehanna. He had told Adam that locals did not go near the quarry anymore, that it had been fenced off years ago, and that Adam should discourage any curiosity seekers or urban explorers who might want to investigate. When Adam asked why, Davison had simply said there had been accidents there, that it was dangerous, and that everyone in Wyalusing knew to stay away. Adam had let the subject drop at the time, but the comment stayed with him. During his first month, he noticed that people avoided even looking in the direction of the quarry access road. When he mentioned it to the woman who ran the diner on Main Street, a pleasant grandmother named Carol Henderson, she had become visibly uncomfortable and changed the subject. When he asked the postal carrier about the history of the quarry, the man had simply shaken his head and said Adam would do well to focus on other matters. The curiosity became harder to ignore. Adam had been trained to investigate, to ask questions when something seemed deliberately hidden. In late September, during a slow afternoon when nothing was happening in town, he decided to drive out to the quarry and see what made it such a forbidden topic. The access road was indeed gated and chained, with multiple no trespassing signs warning of dangerous conditions. But the gate was old, and the chain had rusted enough that Adam was able to force it open with minimal effort. He drove his patrol vehicle down the overgrown dirt road for approximately half a mile before it opened into a clearing where the quarry sat like a wound in the landscape. The quarry had been a limestone operation according to the records Adam had reviewed at the County Historical Society. It had operated from 1947 until 1983, providing material for construction projects throughout the region. After it closed, it had been abandoned, the equipment removed, but the excavation left as a massive hole roughly 200 feet across and 60 feet deep. Rainwater had filled the bottom, creating a dark pool that reflected the surrounding trees like a mirror. Adam parked and walked to the edge, looking down at the water. The sides of the quarry were steep and showed signs of erosion. He could understand why it would be dangerous, why children would need to be kept away. But that did not explain the level of avoidance he had witnessed, the way people refused to even discuss it. He was about to leave when he noticed something unusual. Along the western edge of the quarry, partially hidden by undergrowth, were several wooden crosses. They were simple constructions weathered by years of exposure, some leaning at angles where the ground had shifted. Adam counted 7 of them, all unmarked, all positioned as if marking graves, though there was no evidence of burial. Adam photographed the crosses and returned to town with more questions than answers. That evening he visited Mayor Davison at his home, a tidy ranch house on Elm Street. Davison seemed unsurprised by Adam's visit and invited him inside with resignation rather than hospitality. Davison explained that the crosses marked the spots where 7 workers had died during the quarry's operation. 3 had died in a 1952 accident when a wall collapsed. 2 had died in a 1968 explosion caused by faulty equipment. 2 more had died in separate incidents in the late 1970s. The quarry had developed a reputation for being cursed, and workers had become increasingly reluctant to take jobs there. The closure in 1983 had been as much about labor shortages as economic factors. Adam asked why the bodies had not been moved to proper cemeteries. Davison had looked uncomfortable and explained that the bodies had never been recovered. The 1952 collapse had buried the men under tons of rock that would have been too expensive to excavate. The explosion had been so violent that remains could not be completely collected. The other deaths had involved workers falling into machinery or unstable ground giving way, situations where recovery was deemed too dangerous or impossible. Adam asked why the community had not at least erected proper memorials. Davison had no good answer for that, eventually admitting that people in Wylesing preferred to forget about the quarry entirely, that discussing it brought bad luck, that some things were better left alone. Over the following weeks, Adam began investigating the quarry deaths more thoroughly. He accessed old newspaper archives and found that the reporting on the accidents had been minimal, just brief articles mentioning fatalities without detailed investigation. He found no records of inquests or safety reviews. The company that had operated the quarry, Susquehanna Materials Limited, had dissolved in 1984, and tracking down any surviving executives or workers proved difficult. But Adam did find 3 former quarry workers still living in the region. The first, a man named Eugene Porter, who now lived in Towanda, refused to speak with him at all, closing the door in Adam's face when he identified himself. The second, Raymond Walsh in Sayre, agreed to talk but became evasive when Adam asked about the deaths. Walsh insisted the accidents had been legitimate, that quarry work was dangerous, that people died in industrial settings all the time. The third worker, a man named Vincent Kowalski, who lived in a nursing home in Elmira, New York, was more forthcoming. Kowalski was 86 years old and suffering from emphysema, his voice barely above a rasp. But what he told Adam changed everything. According to Kowalski, the deaths at the quarry had not been accidents. They had been murders. Kowalski claimed that Susquehanna Materials had been owned by a man named Thomas Wickersham, who had also controlled other businesses in Bradford County through various shell companies and partnerships. Wickersham had been involved in smuggling operations along the Susquehanna River, moving stolen goods and contraband through Pennsylvania using the quarry as a distribution point. Workers who discovered what was happening or threatened to report it were eliminated and their deaths staged as industrial accidents. The local authorities had been paid to accept the accident explanations without investigation. Kowalski had kept silent for decades out of fear, but now, dying in a nursing home, far from Wyalusing, he felt the need to finally tell someone the truth. He gave Adam names, dates, and details about the smuggling operation. He described how bodies had been disposed of in ways that made recovery impossible. He explained that many people in Wyalusing had known or suspected what was happening, but had said nothing because Wickersham had essentially owned the town through employment and strategic payments. Adam returned to Wyalusing with Kowalski's information and began discreetly checking property records and old business licenses. He found that Thomas Wickersham had indeed owned multiple businesses in Bradford County during the 1950s through 1980s. He found that several current business owners and local officials were related to or had financial connections to Wickersham's operations. He began to understand that he had stumbled into something that the entire community had conspired to bury, along with the men in the quarry. He made the mistake of being too obvious in his investigation. Within 2 weeks of returning from Elmira, Adam began receiving warnings. Anonymous notes left on his patrol vehicle, phone calls in the middle of the night with no one speaking on the other end. His apartment was broken into while he was on patrol. Nothing stolen, but everything searched. His belongings left in subtle disarray that was clearly intended as a message. Mayor Davison called him into a meeting and told him directly that investigating the quarry was not in his job description, that he had been hired to keep the peace in the present, not dig up the past. When Adam suggested that 7 murders should not be ignored regardless of how much time had passed, Davison told him that pursuing the matter would be bad for his career and possibly his health. Adam contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and requested to speak with someone about what he had discovered. He was told that without physical evidence or living witnesses beyond Kowalski, who might not be considered reliable given his age and medical condition, there was little that could be done. The state police suggested that Adam focus on his current duties and let historical matters remain historical, but Adam could not let it go. He drove back to the quarry with ground-penetrating radar equipment he had borrowed from a contact in Reading. He spent 2 days scanning the area around the quarry, looking for anything that might provide physical evidence. He found several anomalies in the soil that could have been burial sites, but would require excavation to confirm. The night after his second day at the quarry, 3 men came to his apartment. They did not identify themselves, but Adam recognized one of them as the cousin of Mayor Davison. They told him he had a choice. He could pack his belongings and leave Wyalusing by the end of the week, accepting a payment of $20,000 for his trouble and signing a non-disclosure agreement about his investigation. Or he could stay and face consequences that were not explicitly stated but clearly implied. Adam spent that night weighing his options. He could push forward, potentially exposing decades-old crimes, but putting himself at serious risk in a town where he had no real allies and limited resources. Or he could walk away, taking the payment and preserving his safety while letting the dead remain unmourned and their killers protected by time and conspiracy. He made his decision by morning. He packed his belongings, accepted the payment, and left Wyalusing before the week ended. He moved back to Reading and used the money to start over, eventually taking a job with a private security firm where the moral complications were less absolute. Vincent Kowalski died 3 months later, taking his testimony with him. The quarry remained fenced and forgotten. The crosses continued to mark the spots where men had died and been left without justice. Wyalusing continued as it always had, a quiet town along the river, where everyone knew to mind their business and leave certain questions unasked. Adam tried to justify his decision to himself for months afterward, telling himself that some battles could not be won, that exposing corruption from decades past would not bring the dead back, that survival sometimes required compromise. But late at night, when he could not sleep, he thought about those 7 crosses and wondered how many other small towns in Pennsylvania harbored similar secrets, buried in quarries and covered by collective silence, protected by the understanding that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Nora Blackwell had been living with her roommate Stephanie Chen for 8 months when Stephanie disappeared from their second-floor apartment in State College, Pennsylvania. They had met through a roommate matching service affiliated with Penn State University, where Nora was pursuing a graduate degree in environmental science, and Stephanie was working as a lab technician in the biology department. Their arrangement had been practical rather than deeply personal. 2 young women sharing expenses in a college town where rent was inflated by student demand. But they had developed what Nora believed was a comfortable friendship built on mutual respect and compatible schedules. The morning of November 7th, 2017, had been unremarkable. Nora had left their apartment on Foster Avenue at 7:30 to teach an undergraduate lab section, leaving Stephanie at the kitchen table eating breakfast and reading something on her phone. Stephanie had mentioned she had the day off from the lab and planned to run errands and maybe drive to the mall in Altoona. When Nora returned that evening at 6:15, she had expected to find Stephanie cooking dinner or watching television in the living room, the usual rhythms of their shared domestic life. Instead, she found the apartment empty, Stephanie's breakfast dishes still sitting on the kitchen table, her phone plugged into the charger beside her bed, her purse hanging on the hook by the front door. Stephanie's car, a silver Honda Civic that she had parked in their designated spot behind the building, was gone. But everything else about the scene suggested she had stepped out for just a moment and intended to return immediately. Nora had called Stephanie's phone repeatedly, listening to it ring in the bedroom while growing increasingly anxious. She had texted Stephanie's friends, whose number she had in her own phone, asking if anyone had heard from her. By 9 that evening, when Stephanie had been unreachable for over 12 hours, Nora called the State College Police Department to report her roommate missing. The responding officers, a man and woman who introduced themselves as Officer David Martinez and Officer Sarah Chen, had taken Nora's statement with professional thoroughness. They had asked about Stephanie's habits, her relationships, any recent changes in behavior or mood. Nora had explained that Stephanie had seemed completely normal that morning, that there had been no arguments or tensions between them, that Stephanie had no history of mental health issues or impulsive behavior as far as Nora knew. The officers had examined the apartment, noting the phone and purse left behind, the lack of any signs of struggle or forced entry. But Nora had seen something shift in their expressions when they learned that Stephanie had taken her car. Officer Martinez had explained gently that adults had the right to leave if they chose, that without evidence of foul play, they could file a missing person report, but active investigation would be limited. Nora had insisted that Stephanie leaving without her phone and purse made no sense, that something was clearly wrong. The officers had promised to follow up and had given Nora a case number before leaving. The investigation that followed was frustratingly minimal from Nora's perspective. Police located Stephanie's car 3 days later, abandoned in a parking lot at the Nittany Mall in State College, just 4 miles from their apartment. The car was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, no signs of disturbance inside. Security footage from the mall showed Stephanie parking the car at approximately 9:20 on the morning of November 7th, but the angle did not capture what happened after she exited the vehicle. She had simply walked out of the frame and vanished. Within a week, the police focus had shifted in a direction that made Nora's stomach churn. Detectives began asking her detailed questions about her relationship with Stephanie, about whether they had argued, about what Nora had been doing during the hours when Stephanie disappeared. The questions were polite but pointed, and Nora realized with growing horror that she was being investigated as a potential suspect in what police clearly believed might be a homicide, despite the lack of any body or crime scene. The interrogations became more intense. Detectives questioned her about inconsistencies in her timeline, about why she had not called police sooner, about whether she and Stephanie had been romantically involved. They examined her phone records, her computer, her financial transactions. They interviewed her professors and friends, asking questions that made Nora sound suspicious rather than concerned. Local news picked up the story, and Nora found herself described in articles as the last person to see Stephanie Chen alive, a phrase that carried implicit accusation. Nora hired an attorney, a woman named Patricia Hernandez, who specialized in criminal defense. Hernandez advised Nora to stop speaking with police without legal representation present, to document everything she remembered about November 7th, and to prepare for the possibility of being charged despite the complete absence of evidence that any crime had occurred. The stress destroyed Nora's ability to focus on her graduate work. She stopped attending classes, stopped responding to emails, spent her days in the apartment that had become both crime scene and prison. But even as she struggled with being treated as a suspect, Nora could not stop thinking about Stephanie herself. Where had she gone? Why had she left her phone and purse? What had happened at the Nittany Mall that had caused her to abandon her car? Nora began conducting her own investigation, driven partly by the need to clear her name, but mostly by genuine concern for the woman who had shared her living space for 8 months. She started by going through Stephanie's belongings with permission from Stephanie's parents, who had driven to State College from their home in New Jersey the week after the disappearance. What Nora found troubled her. Stephanie had kept a second phone hidden in her bedroom, an old model that was not connected to any service plan but contained saved text messages from someone identified only as M. The messages suggested Stephanie had been involved in some kind of business arrangement, discussing packages and deliveries and payments in vague terms that could have been innocent but felt deliberately obscure. Nora also found bank statements showing that Stephanie had been depositing large amounts of cash irregularly over the past 6 months, sometimes $2,000 or $3,000 at a time. Stephanie's salary at the university lab had been modest, around $30,000 annually, and the deposits did not match any paycheck pattern. When Nora showed these findings to the police, they thanked her, but seemed to treat the information as confirming their suspicion that something criminal had occurred, and that Nora might have been involved. Desperate for answers, Nora began reaching out to Stephanie's co-workers at the biology lab. Most were reluctant to speak with her, aware that she was considered a suspect. But one lab assistant, a young man named Kevin Torres, eventually agreed to meet Nora for coffee off campus. Torres told her that Stephanie had been acting strangely for months before her disappearance, taking frequent unexplained absences, receiving mysterious phone calls that made her visibly nervous. Torres suspected Stephanie had been involved in something illegal, but had no concrete evidence. Torres also mentioned that Stephanie had been dating someone casually, a man she had met online, but had been secretive about. Stephanie had mentioned the name Marcus once, but had provided no other details. Nora searched through Stephanie's computer and found an online dating profile under a username that matched one Stephanie had used elsewhere. The messages revealed that Stephanie had indeed been seeing someone named Marcus Hendricks, and that their last communication had been on November 5th, 2 days before she disappeared. Nora brought this information to her attorney, who who passed it to the police. Detectives located Marcus Hendricks, a 34-year-old construction worker living in Bellefonte. Hendricks voluntarily came in for questioning and admitted he had been seeing Stephanie casually, but claimed he had not seen or heard from her after November 5th. He said they had argued during their last meeting about Stephanie's reluctance to introduce him to her friends or make their relationship more serious. Police investigated Hendricks thoroughly, but found no evidence connecting him to Stephanie's disappearance. As weeks turned to months, the case grew cold. Police had exhausted their immediate leads and had found no body, no crime scene, no witnesses to any act of violence. Nora remained under a cloud of suspicion, but was never charged with any crime. She completed her semester poorly, her grades suffering from the constant stress. She considered leaving state college, but felt trapped by the sense that leaving would make her look guilty. In March 2018, 4 months after Stephanie disappeared, Nora received an anonymous email to her university account. The message contained a single photograph showing Stephanie standing on a beach somewhere tropical, very much alive, wearing sunglasses and casual clothes. The photo metadata showed it had been taken on February 14, 2018. The email included no text, no explanation, no return address that could be traced. Nora immediately forwarded the photo to police and to Stephanie's parents. The image was analyzed and determined to be authentic, not manipulated or fabricated. But investigators could not determine where the photo had been taken or who had sent it. Attempts to trace the email led nowhere, routed through multiple servers and VPN connections that obscured its origin. The photograph changed everything about the investigation. If Stephanie was alive as of February, then no murder had occurred, and Nora could not possibly be responsible for a disappearance that was clearly voluntary. But it raised more questions than it answered. Why had Stephanie staged her own disappearance? Where was she now? Who had sent the photograph, and why? Nora's attorney suggested that Stephanie had been involved in something criminal and had fled to avoid consequences. The cash deposits, the secret phone, the abandoned car, all pointed to someone trying to disappear deliberately rather than someone who had been abducted or harmed. Police eventually closed the active investigation, reclassifying Stephanie's case as a voluntary missing person. But Stephanie's parents refused to accept that explanation. They insisted their daughter would never have abandoned her life without telling them, would never have put them through the agony of believing she might be dead. They hired private investigators who pursued leads around the country, following rumors and possible sightings that never led to concrete results. Nora graduated with her master's degree in 2019 and moved to Oregon for a position with an environmental consulting firm. She left state college carrying the weight of an experience that had fundamentally changed how she understood trust and privacy. She thought often about the 8 months she had spent living with Stephanie, about all the conversations and shared meals and ordinary moments of domestic life, and realized how little she had actually known about the person sleeping in the room next to hers. Sometimes she wondered if Stephanie had planned her disappearance long before November 7th, if everything about their roommate relationship had been calculated to provide cover for whatever Stephanie was really doing. Other times, she wondered if something had happened suddenly that had forced Stephanie to run, if the person in that beach photograph was living in freedom or fear. The case remained officially unsolved. Anyone with information about Stephanie Chen's whereabouts was asked to contact the State College Police Department. But as years passed with no new developments, the case faded from public attention, becoming just another file in a cabinet full of people who had chosen to vanish from their old lives and start again somewhere new, for reasons known only to themselves. Tyler Brennan had taken the job as a technical writer for a small environmental consulting firm, specifically because it allowed him to work remotely from anywhere with reliable internet. At 29, he had grown tired of Philadelphia's noise and expense, and when he discovered he could rent an entire house in Emporium, Pennsylvania, for less than half what his city apartment cost, the decision seemed obvious. Emporium sat deep in the Pennsylvania wilds, a region of dense forest and isolated communities in Cameron County, where the population of the entire county was barely 5,000 people spread across nearly 400 square miles. Tyler moved to Emporium in September 2019, driving his packed Honda through increasingly remote landscapes until he reached the small town that would be his home for the foreseeable future. The house he had rented was a simple 2-story structure on Spruce Street, walking distance from the tiny downtown that consisted of a grocery store, a diner, a post office, and a handful of other businesses that seemed to exist more from habit than economic necessity. The landlord, an elderly man named Frank Morrison, who lived in Williamsport, had been grateful to find a tenant willing to sign a year lease, explaining that many properties in Emporium sat empty because young people moved away for work and retirees preferred towns with better medical facilities. What Tyler had not known when he signed the lease, what Frank Morrison had not mentioned, and what did not appear in any online descriptions of the town, was that Emporium had experienced an unusual number of disappearances over the past 4 decades. He learned about this pattern gradually, through conversations and observations that accumulated into a disturbing picture of a community haunted by unexplained absences. The first mention came during his second week in town when Tyler stopped at the diner for breakfast. He had been reading a local history book he had found at the small public library, and he asked the waitress, a woman in her 50s named Barbara Chen, about some of the families mentioned in the book. Barbara had been friendly until Tyler mentioned the name Catherine Walsh. Her expression had closed immediately, and she had said only that the Walsh family had left town years ago, and that Tyler should probably read something more current. The abrupt change in demeanor had been jarring enough that Tyler remembered it clearly. The second incident occurred in October, when Tyler had been exploring the hiking trails that surrounded Emporium. He had gotten turned around in the woods and had emerged near a cemetery he had not known existed. Walking through it, he noticed something unusual. There were multiple headstones marked only with names and birth years, but no death dates. He counted 7 of them, scattered throughout the cemetery, all for people who had been born between 1950 and 1980. When he mentioned this to his landlord during a phone call about a plumbing issue, Frank Morrison had gone silent for several seconds before changing the subject entirely. Tyler began investigating deliberately after that, driven by the same curiosity that had made him good at his job researching and writing technical reports. He searched newspaper archives and found brief articles about missing persons dating back to 1977. The first was a young woman named Jennifer Walsh, age 19, who had disappeared in August 1977 while walking home from her job at a lumber mill. The second was a man named David Torres, age 42, who had vanished in 1983 after telling his wife he was going to check on some hunting equipment in the woods. The articles continued through the decades, roughly 1 disappearance every few years. Always people who had last been seen on the outskirts of town or in the surrounding forest. By November, Tyler had documented 17 cases spanning from 1977 to 2016. The most recent was a college student named Marcus Hendricks, who had been visiting family in Emporium during Christmas break and had gone for a hike on December 27, 2016. He had never returned, and despite extensive searches involving state police and volunteer searchers, no trace of him had ever been found. What made the pattern more disturbing was that none of the disappearances had generated significant media attention or ongoing investigation. Each case had been reported, searched briefly, and then quietly closed as unsolved. There were no task forces, no special investigations, no apparent recognition that 17 people vanishing from a town of 1,500 residents over 40 years represented a statistical impossibility, unless something systematic was occurring. Tyler tried to discuss his findings with people in town and encountered resistance that ranged from uncomfortable silence to outright hostility. The librarian, when asked about local history records, claimed that many documents had been lost in a flood years earlier. The owner of the grocery store, when Tyler casually mentioned the disappearances, had suggested that Tyler might be happier living somewhere else if he was going to dwell on negative history. Even the local police chief, a man named Robert Daniels, who Tyler encountered at the post office, had been dismissive when Tyler asked about the pattern, saying that people went missing in rural areas all the time, and that it was not as unusual as outsiders thought. The unified response troubled Tyler more than the disappearances themselves. It suggested not just ignorance, but active suppression of information, a community-wide agreement to avoid acknowledging what had been happening in their midst for decades. Tyler considered leaving, taking Frank Morrison up on the offer to break the lease early if he was unhappy. But something kept him investigating, a combination of stubbornness and genuine concern that people were being lost and no one with authority seemed to care. In December, Tyler found something that changed the nature of his investigation. He had been hiking one of the trails north of town, carrying his GPS and camera to document the area, when he noticed something unusual about the landscape. The trail followed an old logging road that wound through dense hemlock forest. But at several points, Tyler noticed that the trees growing closest to the road were significantly younger than the surrounding forest. He examined the stumps of what had been cut and realized they had been removed relatively recently, perhaps within the past 20 years. Following one of these paths of younger growth off the main trail, Tyler found a clearing that did not appear on any map he had consulted. In the center of the clearing was a structure, partially collapsed and overgrown with vegetation, that looked like it might have once been a small cabin or storage building. Tyler photographed everything and carefully explored the area, finding remnants of what appeared to be camping equipment, empty food containers with dates from various years, and something that made his blood run cold: a wallet containing identification for David Torres, the man who had disappeared in 1983. Tyler took the wallet and hiked back to town immediately. He went straight to the police station, where Chief Daniels was working despite it being a Sunday afternoon. When Tyler showed him the wallet and explained where he had found it, he expected interest or concern. Instead, Daniels looked at the wallet for a long moment, then looked at Tyler with an expression that was difficult to read. Daniels asked Tyler to show him exactly where he had found the structure. Tyler agreed, and they drove together in the police cruiser to the trailhead. But when they hiked to where Tyler had been just hours earlier, the clearing was different. The collapsed structure was still there, but it had been cleared of debris. The camping equipment was gone. The food containers were gone. And when Daniels examined the wallet Tyler had found, he claimed the identification looked fake, that the photo quality was wrong for 1983, that someone was probably playing a prank. Tyler knew what he had seen. He knew the wallet had been real. But standing in that clearing with Chief Daniels, who was now suggesting they should head back to town before dark, Tyler realized he had crossed some invisible line. He had found evidence of something that people in Emporium did not want found, and his discovery had triggered a response that was both swift and thorough. That night, Tyler's house was broken into while he slept. Nothing was stolen, but his computer was gone, along with his external hard drive, where he had stored all his research about the disappearances. His phone, which he had been charging in the kitchen, was smashed beyond repair. When he reported the break-in to police the next morning, a different officer took the report and promised to investigate. But Tyler knew nothing would come of it. He bought a new phone and spent the next week trying to recreate his research from memory and from online archives. But many of the newspaper articles he had previously accessed were no longer available through the library's digital portal, and the librarian claimed she did not know why they had been removed from the database. Tyler received a visit from Frank Morrison in mid-December. The landlord, who had never come to Emporium during Tyler's entire tenancy, arrived unannounced and suggested over coffee that Tyler might want to consider moving back to Philadelphia. The town was not for everyone, Morrison explained. Some people found the isolation unsettling. Morrison offered to return Tyler's full security deposit and waive the remaining months on the lease if Tyler agreed to leave by the end of the year. Tyler asked Morrison directly if he knew about the disappearances, if there was something happening in Emporium that people were covering up. Morrison had stared at his coffee for a long time before answering. He said that some places had histories that outsiders did not understand. The communities sometimes made choices about what to remember and what to forget, and that Tyler should be very careful about pushing too hard against doors that people wanted to keep closed. Tyler left Emporium on December 22, 2019. He packed everything he owned into his car and drove back to Philadelphia, where he moved into a cramped sublet and tried to resume the life he had left 4 months earlier. But he could not stop thinking about the 17 people who had vanished from that small town in the Pennsylvania wilds, about the community that had closed ranks around whatever truth explained their disappearances, about the wallet from 1983 that had been sitting in a collapsed structure for decades until someone made it disappear again within hours of its discovery. Tyler tried several times to interest journalists in the story, sending his recreated research to reporters at regional newspapers and television stations. No one responded with more than polite acknowledgement. He contacted the Pennsylvania State Police and was told that, without new evidence or credible leads, cold cases from decades past could not be prioritized. He posted about his experiences on forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries and missing persons, but his accounts generated more skepticism than concern. Eventually, Tyler stopped actively investigating. He kept copies of what little documentation he had managed to preserve, but he moved on with his life, accepting a new job and trying to forget about the months he had spent in a town where 17 people had disappeared, and no one would acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. But sometimes, late at night, Tyler searched online for news from Emporium, looking for reports of new disappearances, hoping that someone else would notice the pattern and have more success than he had at forcing people to confront their truth. The searches never revealed anything. Emporium remained what it had always been, a quiet town in a remote part of Pennsylvania, where nothing remarkable ever seemed to happen, and where people who asked too many questions learned to leave before they became part of the history that no one wanted to discuss. Victoria Brennan had never been close to her Aunt Diane, who had lived alone in a deteriorating Victorian house in New Hope, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, for as long as Victoria could remember. Diane had been her father's younger sister, a woman who had chosen solitude over family connections and who had declined invitations to holidays and birthdays with such consistency that eventually the invitations stopped coming. When Diane died in February 2020 at age 73 from complications of pneumonia, Victoria was surprised to learn she had been named the sole beneficiary of Diane's estate, which consisted primarily of the house on Mechanic Street and whatever belongings remained inside. Victoria, who was 31 and working as a paralegal in Philadelphia, drove to New Hope on a cold Saturday in March to assess what she had inherited. The house looked worse than she remembered from childhood visits decades earlier. The paint had long since peeled away from the clapboard siding, exposing weathered wood beneath. Several windows were cracked or broken. The front porch sagged in the middle, and the yard had become overgrown with weeds that pushed through remnants of what had once been careful landscaping. The house looked abandoned rather than recently occupied, though Diane had been living there until she was hospitalized 2 weeks before her death. The interior was worse. Diane had apparently become a hoarder in her later years, filling every room with newspapers, magazines, boxes, and random objects that created narrow pathways through otherwise impassable spaces. The smell of mildew and decay permeated everything. Victoria stood in the front hallway fighting back tears, overwhelmed by the magnitude of cleaning that would be required before the house could be sold or even properly evaluated. She spent the day making preliminary assessments, photographing rooms, creating lists of what would need to be done. The kitchen was a health hazard, with decades of grime coating every surface. The bathroom fixtures were corroded beyond saving. The furniture was either damaged by water leaks or infested with insects. Victoria was mentally calculating demolition costs when she noticed something unusual about the second-floor hallway. The wall at the end showed a seam that did not match the surrounding construction, as if a doorway had been sealed with drywall and then painted to blend in. Victoria had studied the house's floor plan in the estate documents, which showed 4 bedrooms on the second floor. But when she counted the doors in the hallway, she found only 3. The sealed doorway would lead to the 4th bedroom, the one that appeared on the original architectural drawings but was absent from the actual layout of the house. She called a contractor the following Monday, a man named Robert Chen, who specialized in historic renovations. Chen came that Wednesday, examined the wall, and confirmed that a doorway had been closed off, probably sometime in the 1980s based on the type of drywall and tape compound used. When Victoria asked him to open it, Chen had hesitated, asking if she was sure she wanted to know what was behind a wall that someone had deliberately sealed. Victoria had insisted, and Chen had agreed to return on Saturday with his tools. The work took less than an hour. Chen cut through the drywall carefully, removing sections until the old doorframe was exposed. The door itself was still in place behind the newer wall, locked from the hallway side, with a deadbolt that had been painted over multiple times. Chen used a drill to remove the lock mechanism, and the door swung inward with a creak that suggested the hinges had not moved in decades. The room beyond was approximately 12 feet by 14 feet, with a single window that had been boarded over from the inside. The air that escaped when the door opened carried a smell of old paper and something else Victoria could not immediately identify. Chen had installed temporary work lights in the hallway, and their illumination revealed a space that made Victoria's stomach drop. The room had been converted into something between an archive and a shrine. The walls were covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes, all carefully arranged and preserved behind sheets of plastic that had been stapled to the wall. The floor was covered with cardboard boxes, each labeled with a name and date range, and in the center of the room, on a folding table, sat what looked like evidence from a crime scene. Clothing items sealed in plastic bags, jewelry arranged in labeled containers, and 3 ring binders filled with what appeared to be surveillance photographs. Victoria stood in the doorway while Chen examined the room from behind her. He suggested they should probably call the police before touching anything. Victoria agreed, though her hands were shaking as she dialed the number for the New Hope Police Department. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. After examining the room and the materials it contained, they called their supervisor, who called the Bucks County District Attorney's office. By evening, Victoria's inherited house had become a crime scene, with investigators photographing every item and carefully documenting the contents of the sealed room. What they found was documentation of a murder that had occurred in 1985, 35 years earlier. The victim had been a young woman named Catherine Walsh, age 22, who had been found dead in her apartment in Doylestown on August 14, 1985. She had been strangled, and her apartment had been ransacked in what police at the time believed was a robbery gone wrong. The case had gone cold after initial investigations failed to identify any suspects. The room in Diane's house contained evidence that had never been turned over to police. There were photographs of Catherine, taken without her knowledge in the days and weeks before her death, showing her at work, at home, running errands. There were handwritten notes detailing her schedule, her habits, her routines. There was clothing that appeared to have been taken from Catherine's apartment, including a distinctive scarf that had been mentioned in the original police report as missing from the crime scene. But most disturbing were the journals. Diane had kept detailed records documenting what appeared to be an obsessive fixation on Catherine Walsh. The entries described watching Catherine, following her, fantasizing about confronting her. The final entries, written in the days after the murder, described feelings of relief and satisfaction that were horrifying in their casual brutality. Victoria spent 3 days being interviewed by detectives who were trying to understand Diane's connection to the victim and whether Victoria had known anything about her aunt's secrets. The investigation revealed that Diane and Catherine had worked together briefly at a bookstore in New Hope in 1984. Catherine had apparently rejected Diane's attempts at friendship, and this rejection had triggered an obsession that had culminated in murder. Detectives found additional evidence in the sealed room that connected Diane definitively to the crime. Hair and fiber evidence that had been collected but not properly analyzed in 1985 was re-examined using modern DNA technology. The results confirmed that Diane had been present in Catherine's apartment at the time of her death. Handwriting analysis matched the threatening notes that had been sent to Catherine in the weeks before the murder to samples of Diane's writing found throughout the house. The case was officially solved in April 2020, 35 years after Catherine Walsh had been killed. Diane Brennan was identified posthumously as the murderer. Though she would never face trial or punishment for what she had done, Catherine's family, who had spent decades seeking answers, were notified of the breakthrough. They expressed gratitude for the resolution, but also grief that it had come too late for meaningful justice. Victoria struggled to process what she had discovered. She had inherited not just a house, but evidence of murder committed by a woman she had known, however distantly, throughout her childhood. She thought about family gatherings where Diane had been invited and had declined, wondered if Diane's isolation had been driven by guilt over what she had done or by fear of discovery. She thought about the sealed room and what it meant that Diane had kept the evidence rather than destroying it, as if the documentation of the crime was too important to discard. The house could not be sold until the investigation was complete. The sealed room remained off-limits for weeks while forensic teams processed every item. Victoria hired a company that specialized in trauma scene cleanup to handle the eventual restoration, unable to imagine doing the work herself, knowing what the house contained. By summer, the investigation had concluded, and the house was returned to Victoria's control. She made the decision to have it demolished rather than renovated, unable to imagine anyone living there with knowledge of its history. The demolition took place in August 2020, 5 months after Victoria had first opened that sealed door. Catherine Walsh's family held a memorial service that Victoria attended, feeling obligated to represent her family in acknowledging the harm Diane had caused. Catherine's sister, Rebecca, spoke about the decades of not knowing, the theories and suspicions that had tormented the family, the relief of finally having answers, even though those answers came too late to bring Catherine back or to hold her killer accountable. Victoria sold the empty lot in November for significantly less than the property would have been worth with the house intact. She used part of the money to establish a scholarship fund in Catherine Walsh's name at the community college where Catherine had been studying nursing before her death. It felt inadequate, a gesture that could never balance the scales of what Diane had taken and what Victoria had unknowingly inherited, along with that deteriorating Victorian house. The case made local news and was covered by several true crime podcasts, always with Victoria identified only as the niece who had discovered the evidence. She declined interview requests, unwilling to profit from or sensationalize what had happened. She changed jobs 6 months later, leaving the paralegal position in Philadelphia for work with a nonprofit in Baltimore, needing the distance and the fresh start. But sometimes Victoria still thought about that sealed room and what it represented. A life taken and a secret kept for 35 years in a space that measured 12 by 14 feet. She thought about how close the evidence had come to being lost forever if Diane had died, even a few years earlier, when she might have still had the physical capacity to destroy what she had preserved. and she wondered how many other sealed rooms existed in houses across Pennsylvania and beyond, containing evidence of crimes that would remain unsolved until chance or inheritance brought them to light. Evan Torres had been driving home from a conference in Cleveland when his GPS rerouted him through back roads in western Pennsylvania due to an accident on Interstate 80. It was just past 11 at night on a Tuesday in March 2021, and the roads through Lawrence County were dark and nearly empty. Evan, who was 33 and worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, had been looking forward to getting home to his apartment in Harrisburg and sleeping in his own bed after 3 days of conference hotels and business dinners. He was driving along Route 18 near the Ohio border, about 15 miles south of New Castle, when he saw the car pulled over on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing. Years of his mother's warnings about helping strangers warred with his general sense that leaving someone stranded on a dark road was wrong. The car was a newer model sedan, not the kind of vehicle that suggested criminal intent. And when Evan slowed down, he could see a figure standing beside the driver's door, clearly visible in his headlights. Evan pulled over ahead of the disabled vehicle and walked back, his phone in his hand, with the emergency call screen ready just in case. The person by the car was a man in his 40s, wearing business casual clothing and looking frustrated rather than threatening. He introduced himself as Marcus Chen and explained that his car had simply died, all electrical systems failing at once. He had been trying to call for a tow truck but had no cell service in this area. He asked if Evan could give him a ride to the next town, or at least somewhere with phone reception so he could make arrangements. Evan agreed, feeling reasonably confident that the situation was legitimate. They walked back to Evan's car together, Marcus carrying a small overnight bag and continuing to complain about the timing of the breakdown and how it was going to ruin his schedule for the next day. They were nearly to Evan's vehicle when Marcus suddenly stopped walking and grabbed Evan's arm. That was when Evan heard it. A sound coming from Marcus's car, faint but distinct. It sounded like thumping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the trunk. Evan looked at Marcus, whose expression had changed completely. The frustration had been replaced with something harder, more calculating. Marcus told Evan to keep walking, his grip on Evan's arm tightening in a way that left no question about it being a threat rather than a request. Evan's mind raced through options. He was 30 feet from his car, but Marcus was between him and the driver's door. His phone was still in his hand, but he could not make a call with Marcus holding his arm. The thumping from the trunk continued, someone clearly trying to signal for help. Evan made a decision based on instinct rather than planning. He twisted away from Marcus's grip and ran, not toward his car, but into the darkness of the field beside the road. Marcus shouted something behind him, but Evan did not stop to listen. He ran through grass and over uneven ground, hearing Marcus crashing through the vegetation behind him, but not daring to look back or slow down. He held his phone up as he ran, watching the signal indicator desperately, hoping for enough bars to complete a call. After perhaps 200 yards, he saw one bar appear. He hit the emergency call button without stopping, still running as the connection went through. The 911 operator answered, and Evan gasped out information between breaths. Location on Route 18 south of New Castle. Man with someone trapped in his trunk. Need police immediately. The operator asked him to stay on the line, but Evan could hear Marcus getting closer behind him. He ended the call to preserve battery and focus on running, angling back toward the road further south, where he hoped Marcus's car would not be visible. He reached the road approximately half a mile from where he had stopped, his lungs burning and his legs shaking from the sprint through the field. He stood on the shoulder, trying to decide whether to flag down a passing car or hide in case Marcus drove past looking for him. Before he could choose, he heard sirens approaching from the south. 2 Pennsylvania State Police cruisers appeared, their lights cutting through the darkness. Evan stepped into the road, waving his arms, and the cruisers stopped immediately. The troopers listened to his account with professional intensity. One radioed for backup, while the other took detailed information about the location and the description of Marcus and his vehicle. Within minutes, additional units arrived and a coordinated approach was planned. Evan was told to wait with one trooper while the others moved north to locate the sedan with the person in the trunk. The wait lasted 30 agonizing minutes. Evan sat in the back of the police cruiser, watching through the window as more law enforcement vehicles arrived, including unmarked cars that he assumed belonged to detectives or supervisors. Finally, one of the initial troopers returned and told Evan that they had found the vehicle and rescued the person in the trunk. Marcus Chen, if that was even his real name, had fled on foot, but officers were searching the area with dogs. Evan was driven to the scene where multiple police vehicles surrounded the disabled sedan. He saw a young woman sitting in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket and talking to a female officer. The woman looked to be in her early 20s, with disheveled hair and visible bruises on her face and arms. When she saw Evan, she began crying and asked the officer if she could speak to him. The officer brought Evan over, and the young woman, who identified herself as Rachel Morrison, thanked him through tears. She explained that Marcus had abducted her from a parking lot in Youngstown, Ohio, earlier that evening. She had been walking to her car after her shift at a restaurant when he had forced her into his vehicle at knife point. He had driven for over an hour before the car had experienced electrical problems. When he pulled over, she had started kicking the trunk and had heard voices outside, which had given her hope that someone might hear her and help. Evan stayed at the scene for another 2 hours, giving detailed statements to multiple investigators. They told him that Marcus's real name was Gregory Walsh, and that he was wanted in Ohio for 2 other abductions that had occurred over the past 6 months. One of those victims had been found alive, held captive for 3 days before escaping. The other victim, a 26-year-old woman named Jennifer Torres, was still missing and presumed dead based on evidence found at a property Walsh had been renting. Detective Sarah Chen, who led the investigation for the Pennsylvania State Police, explained to Evan that his decision to run rather than comply with Walsh had likely saved both his life and Rachel's. Walsh had been moving Rachel to a secondary location where he would have more control and privacy. If Evan had gotten into Walsh's car as directed, or if he had simply driven away without stopping, Rachel might have disappeared like Jennifer Torres. The timing of the car breakdown and Evan's decision to help had created a chance for rescue that might not have come again. Walsh was captured 6 hours later, found hiding in a barn approximately 3 miles from where his car had broken down. He was charged with kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder in Pennsylvania, with additional charges pending in Ohio related to the other abductions. Rachel Morrison was treated for her injuries and released to her family. She testified at Walsh's trial 11 months later, describing her ordeal and specifically mentioning Evan's intervention as the reason she was alive to testify. Evan struggled with the aftermath in ways he had not anticipated. He had nightmares about what might have happened if he had not stopped, or if he had gotten into Walsh's car, or if his phone had not found signal when he needed it. He thought constantly about Jennifer Torres, whose body was eventually found buried on property Walsh had been using in rural Ohio. He attended Walsh's sentencing hearing, where Walsh received multiple life sentences without possibility of parole, and felt no satisfaction in the outcome because one victim was still dead, and nothing could change that. Rachel stayed in contact with Evan, sending him messages on holidays and the anniversary of her rescue. She told him she was in therapy working through trauma, but was determined to finish college and become a social worker specializing in helping crime victims. Evan found some comfort in knowing she was building a future that Walsh had tried to take from her. But Evan also found himself unable to drive past someone with car trouble without stopping, even though every rational part of his mind told him that doing so was dangerous. He bought a dash cam for his vehicle and started carrying pepper spray and a better phone charger. He took a self-defense class and learned how to recognize signs of danger that he had been oblivious to before that March night on Route 18. He thought often about the randomness of what had happened. If the conference had ended an hour earlier or later, if the accident on Interstate 80 had not occurred, If Walsh's car had not broken down at that exact location, if Evan had chosen a different route or decided not to stop, the entire sequence of events would have been different. Rachel Morrison might have disappeared, another name added to a list of victims. Her family left with decades of unanswered questions. Detective Chen had told Evan that he was a hero, that his actions had directly resulted in saving a life and capturing a dangerous predator. But Evan did not feel heroic. He felt lucky and frightened and aware of how much violence existed just beneath the surface of ordinary moments. He had stopped to help someone with car trouble, one of the most common scenarios on any highway, and had stumbled into a situation that could easily have ended with him as a victim rather than a rescuer. The case received moderate media coverage, with Evan's identity protected at his request. He declined interview requests from news programs and true crime podcasts, unwilling to relive the experience or have it define his public identity. He returned to his job and his routine, though both felt different now, colored by the knowledge of what he had witnessed and what might have been. Sometimes, late at night when he could not sleep, Evan thought about Jennifer Torres, whose family would never get the outcome that Rachel Morrison's family had received. He thought about how many other Gregory Walshes existed, driving through Pennsylvania and Ohio and every other state, waiting for opportunities that car trouble and isolated roads and human kindness provided. And he wondered whether his mother had been right all along about the dangers of helping strangers, even as he knew he would continue to stop for stranded motorists because the alternative was accepting that fear should govern every decision and that people like Rachel Morrison should be left to their fate. Hannah Brennan was 7 years old when her sister Emily walked into the woods behind their house in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and never came back. It was August 15, 1991, a Thursday afternoon during summer vacation when the humidity hung so thick in the air that breathing felt like work. Emily had been 14, old enough to be trusted in the woods that bordered their property in the Lehigh Valley, woods she had explored hundreds of times since the family had moved there when Hannah was 2. Hannah remembered the afternoon in fragments that had calcified into permanent memory through decades of repetition. Emily had been sitting on the back porch reading a magazine, wearing cut-off denim shorts and a purple tank top. Their mother had been inside preparing dinner, the sound of running water and clattering dishes drifting through the open kitchen window. Their father had been at work at the steel plant, on the 4 to midnight shift that defined their family schedule. Hannah had been playing with dolls in the shade of the oak tree that dominated the backyard. Emily had looked up from her magazine and announced she was going for a walk. She did this often, disappearing into the woods for an hour or two with a book or her Walkman, finding privacy that the small house with its shared bedrooms did not offer. Their mother had called out from the kitchen window that Emily should be back before dinner at 6. Emily had waved acknowledgement and walked across the lawn toward the tree line, where a well-worn path led into the forest. Hannah had watched her sister disappear between the trees, the purple tank top visible for a few more seconds before the dense summer foliage swallowed it entirely. It was the last time anyone in the Brennan family saw Emily alive. When 6 o'clock came and Emily had not returned, their mother, Patricia, had called for her from the back porch. No response. At 6:15, Patricia had walked into the woods along the path Emily always took, calling her daughter's name with increasing urgency. At 6:30, she had returned to the house alone and called Hannah's father at the plant. By 7, Thomas Brennan was home and organizing a search with neighbors. By 8, the Bethlehem Police Department was involved. The search continued through the night and into the following day. Police and volunteers walked systematic grid patterns through the woods, which covered approximately 200 acres and backed up to state game lands that extended for miles. They found nothing. No clothing, no signs of struggle, no indication that Emily had been anywhere in those woods, despite the well-established path she had taken and the hundreds of times she had walked there before. On the third day, search dogs were brought in. The dogs tracked Emily's scent from the house to a point approximately half a mile into the woods, where the path intersected with an old logging road that had not been used in decades. At that intersection, the dogs lost the scent entirely, as if Emily had vanished into the air or been picked up by a vehicle, though no tire tracks were visible on the overgrown road. The investigation consumed the next year of Hannah's childhood. Detectives interviewed everyone who had known Emily, her friends from school, her teachers, the cashiers at the stores where she shopped. They examined her room for evidence of plans to run away or communications with someone who might have lured her into danger. They found nothing suspicious. Emily had been an ordinary teenager, good grades, normal social life. No boyfriend or conflicts that suggested a reason to disappear voluntarily. Theories proliferated. Some believed Emily had been abducted by a stranger, perhaps someone driving the logging road looking for opportunities. Others suggested she had suffered an accident in the woods and had wandered in confusion until she died somewhere searchers had not looked. The most painful theory, whispered by some in the community, was that Emily had run away because of something happening at home, though investigators found no evidence of abuse or family conflict. As months turned to years without resolution, the case grew cold. The Brennan family fractured under the weight of not knowing. Thomas drank more and worked longer hours, avoiding the house where Emily's absence filled every room. Patricia developed severe anxiety and depression that no medication seemed to adequately control. Hannah, who had lost her sister and then effectively lost both parents to grief, grew up in a house that felt like a memorial to someone who might still be alive somewhere. Hannah left Bethlehem at 18, attending college in Pittsburgh, and then building a career in social work in Philadelphia. She married, divorced, built a life that existed in deliberate separation from the tragedy that had defined her childhood. But she never stopped thinking about Emily. Never stopped wondering what had happened in those woods on August 15th, 1991. In 2021, 30 years after Emily's disappearance, Hannah was 47 and working as a supervisor at a nonprofit serving homeless youth. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, still waiting for answers that never came. Her father had followed 6 months later, his liver destroyed by 3 decades of drinking. Hannah had inherited the house in Bethlehem, which she had been renting to tenants but had never been able to bring herself to sell. That summer, Hannah made the decision to return to Bethlehem and renovate the house to prepare it for sale. She took a leave of absence from work and moved into the home where she had spent her childhood, sleeping in her old bedroom while contractors updated the kitchen and bathrooms. It was during the renovation that she decided to finally go through the boxes that her parents had stored in the attic, boxes she had avoided dealing with when clearing their belongings after they died. Among her mother's things, Hannah found a journal that Patricia had kept during the years following Emily's disappearance. The entries were painful to read, documenting grief and guilt and desperate prayers for Emily's return. But toward the end of the journal, in entries from 1997, 6 years after Emily vanished, the tone changed. Patricia had written about receiving a phone call from a woman who claimed to have information about Emily. The woman had refused to give her name, but had told Patricia that Emily had not been taken by a stranger. She had been taken by someone local, someone well-connected in Bethlehem, someone whose involvement had been covered up by people in positions of authority. Patricia had reported the call to police, but according to her journal entries, the detective she spoke with had dismissed it as a crank call from someone trying to exploit a grieving mother. Patricia had not accepted that explanation. She had begun her own investigation, quietly asking questions and trying to identify who might have been responsible. The journal entries described meetings with former neighbors and Emily's old friends, conversations about a man who had lived near the logging road in 1991, a property owner named Richard Daniels, who had connections to local government and law enforcement. The entries ended abruptly in early 1938, with no resolution to what Patricia had been investigating. Hannah sat in the attic surrounded by boxes and dust, holding her mother's journal and feeling rage build in her chest. Her mother had been investigating Emily's disappearance and had identified a potential suspect, and Hannah had known nothing about it. Why had Patricia stopped writing in the journal? What had she discovered, or what had stopped her from continuing? Hannah drove to the Bethlehem Police Department the next day and asked to speak with someone about Emily's case. She was directed to Detective Marcus Walsh, a man in his early 50s who had been with the department for 25 years. Walsh listened to Hannah's account of the journal and promised to review the case file. He called her 2 days later with information that confirmed her mother's investigation had merit. Richard Daniels, the property owner Patricia had suspected, had been investigated in connection with Emily's disappearance, but had been cleared based on an alibi provided by 2 witnesses who claimed he had been with them on August 15, 1991. But Walsh had discovered something troubling in the old case files. The witnesses who provided Daniels' alibi had both been township officials with connections to Daniels through various business relationships. And there had been a notation in the file suggesting that soil samples taken from Daniels' property had shown irregularities, but that the lab analysis had been inconclusive. Walsh explained that Daniels had died in 2015, which meant he could never face criminal charges. But Walsh suggested that with new technology, the old evidence might be worth re-examining. He asked Hannah if she would be willing to allow investigators to search the property where Daniels had lived, which was now owned by someone else, but was mostly undeveloped land. Hannah agreed immediately. Within a week, investigators had obtained permission from the current landowner and brought in ground-penetrating radar equipment to scan areas near where Daniels' house had stood. The search took 3 days and revealed multiple soil anomalies consistent with disturbed earth. On the 4th day, investigators began excavating one of the anomalies. They found Emily on August 8, 2021, 30 years and 3 weeks after she had walked into the woods. Her remains were buried approximately 6 feet deep in what had once been the back corner of Richard Daniels' property, less than 2 miles from the logging road where the search dogs had lost her scent. The forensic analysis took months but eventually confirmed what Hannah had suspected based on her mother's journal. Emily had been killed within hours of her disappearance, likely transported to Daniels' property along the logging road, and buried in a location that had never been searched because Daniels' alibi had removed him from suspicion. The investigation into why Daniels had never been properly investigated revealed a pattern of corruption that had allowed him to avoid accountability for decades. The township officials who had provided his alibi had financial ties to Daniels that should have disqualified them as witnesses. The soil samples that had shown irregularities had been dismissed without adequate follow-up, and Patricia's attempts to raise concerns in 1997 had been actively discouraged by officers who had connections to Daniels through local politics. Hannah attended Emily's funeral in September 2021, burying her sister 30 years after she should have been laid to rest. The ceremony was small, attended by a few of Emily's friends from high school who still lived in the area and who had never forgotten the girl who disappeared. Hannah spoke about Emily's love of reading and hiking, about the sister who had watched over her when they were children, about 30 years of absence that could never be recovered. The house in Bethlehem sold in November. Hannah used part of the proceeds to establish a foundation that provided support to families of missing persons, specifically funding private investigations when official channels had failed. She named it the Emily and Patricia Brennan Foundation, honoring both her sister and the mother who had never stopped searching for answers. Hannah returned to Philadelphia and to her work with homeless youth, carrying new understanding of how institutions could fail people and how persistence in seeking truth could eventually break through walls of silence and corruption. She thought often about her mother, who had been so close to discovering the truth, but had died without knowing that Emily would eventually be found and brought home. Sometimes Hannah drove back to Bethlehem and visited the cemetery where Emily and their parents were now buried together. She would stand by the graves and tell them about the foundation, about the families they were helping, about the cold cases that were being reopened with renewed attention. She liked to imagine that somewhere, Patricia knew that her investigation had not been in vain, that the journal she kept had finally served its purpose, and that Emily's story had ended not with unanswered questions, but with truth and justice delayed but not forever denied.